Well, hello, everybody. Come on in. Welcome. Grab yourself a virtual seat. And welcome to this edition of the online ColdFusion Meetup. I'm Charlie Arehart, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. And in this edition of the Meetup, our 280th, how about that, being recorded on Thursday, January 14th, 2021 at noon U.S. Eastern Time. It's going to be another one of our CF AMAs. Ask Me Anything with me, Charlie Arehart, and Dan Wilson. Hello, Dan.
Hey.
And we can go ahead and put both of us up for the moment. Dan's showing his happy smiley face, and I'm not because I'm on sucky upload bandwidth. It'll be fixed someday soon, but for now it's only 1 meg, and so it's not good to do video sharing. So anyway, hello, Dan. Welcome.
Hey, I can't wait till bandwidth comes to Kentucky.
That's right. Well, and let me tell you, the place that I live, for those who don't know, I live in a very rural part of South Central Kentucky. And my wife and I had looked, because she grew up here, and we had looked at this area 10 years ago. And 10 years ago, there was a place just 5 miles away from where we are, believe it or not, that had high speed, like 100 meg. And unfortunately, where we bought, it's a little more rural and it's not there. But just last year, they laid the fiber, literally laid the fiber. It's coming right to my cabin where I work from, and it's there and it's plugged in. But they have to finish building out this area of several square miles before they'll turn us all on. So the time's coming. Can't wait for it because, it's no fun. Trust me, having only 1 meg upload and about 7 meg download. But let that be a lesson to everybody. Some of you can stream, what's it called? When you attach your phone,
hotspot.
But you can make your phone a Wi-Fi hotspot. There's another term that's used. But anyway, when you do that, people sometimes think, I'll never be able to do anything with that. And I'm telling you, yes, you will, because I've looked, and you generally get a few meg down and about a meg up on your phone. And I've been working that way for now 6 years from this cabin in the woods. And as far as me seeing stuff, it's cool, totally fine. And speaking, it's totally fine. And doing screen shares, as long as I'm not the one sharing my screen, it's totally fine. So anyway, enough about that.
You'd be the one to test, because all day long you're looking at other people's screens as they show you their ColdFusion problems.
That's what I'm saying. I literally do that all day, and thank you for bringing that up. And yes, I do that all day, and never ever a problem. So I'm saying, if you need to see stuff, this is, really low bandwidth is not a problem. It's only when you need to share stuff or show a camera. And that's where we often will tell speakers when they start to break up on our meetups. I'll say, hey, maybe you might want to turn off your camera. And it sometimes makes a difference. But Dan's in a good area in Carolina.
Very funny that in 2021, just feels very bizarre to say that we're calling 7 megs down bad bandwidth. Back in my day, Charlie, 53 kilobits per second was screaming.
Why, I remember when I first started out in computers, I used a 300 baud modem with a phone that you put in an acoustic coupler, and it printed out on a piece of paper. So yes, we can talk about life in the old days when we used to go upload and download in 300 baud both ways. Yeah.
I remember when we got a cable modem service, it wasn't symmetrical. And so I contacted a telecom to see what it would take to get a T1 out there, like a symmetrical T1.
Only $1,000 a month.
$1,500.
$1,500 a month. There you go.
Just $1,500 a month. And now I've got basically a gigabit down and up, and we pay $80, and that includes a phone.
That's awesome. That is awesome.
And it's still not enough. I try to download a Warzone update, a 60 gig Warzone update. Should be 5 minutes, still takes an hour.
Wow, 60 gig. I wouldn't even fathom that. It's hard enough for me pulling down the old ColdFusion Docker images that are a gig. But we can talk more about that soon. And in fact, that'll be one of our topics coming up. So, Dan, we've got some topics. In fact, let's explain to folks who maybe didn't notice it. Welcome to you all who, just show up or had seen the invite. But if you looked closely at the invite that was sent, everybody gets sent an invite, and there's a link. And if you went back to that link to the ColdFusion, or sort of the meetup.com site, you'd seen there that there was a link to a form. So we've had a form where you could ask questions. And so next time we do one of these, note that there is the opportunity for you to fill in that form. And I tweeted about it, and I sent another email this time about it, but you might have missed it. And we've had a few people that took us up on that. So awesome. And so we've got a few of those. And so
yeah, let's tee up the first one, shall we?
Yeah, and if you want to, go ahead and copy it to the clipboard and paste it in as a comment, and we can use the feature to click the button and show it on the screen.
And it's fair to say that since we neglected to ask people what their privacy concerns were, we're not going to use anyone's name today. So everyone is going to be some combination of Steven.
We fixed that, and so going forward, you will be able to pick your name, whether you want to share your name or not. Absolutely.
So Steven has an IoT question about using ColdFusion with a serial port or reading RFID data via a serial port. And I have to admit, I actually haven't ever looked at this, ever.
Right.
And if someone asked me what they should do, I would say, well, it's probably going to involve your sockets or your gateways, but I'm really guessing here. So, you know, Charlie, do you kind of harken back to the serial port days? What is your thoughts and feelings around connecting ColdFusion to a serial port for IoT?
And I'll say that I had not heard of it being done. So this was one where I'm afraid we don't really have a good answer for you. And, you know, and he says not CF specific, but IoT and web browser interaction with a serial port. You know, so it's just getting beyond stuff that I've had to work with, Dan's had to work with, that most people seem to work with. So I'm afraid that's one that we don't have a very good answer for. Not a great one to start with.
If we talk to the architecture here, the serial port to be accessible to ColdFusion, the instance would have to be on the server. And that theoretically is a fundamental possibility. It would be a rarity with most ColdFusion servers. Most ColdFusion servers live in a database. Live in a data center somewhere, whether it's managed or owned. They're very rarely sitting next to your sprinkler where your serial port's connected into your lawn sprinkler. So I guess if we're kind of rolling this back, it's really the machine that owns the serial port. And so you need something that can access things at the machine level.
And so I think that's what he was getting at. If you look at that, it says, you know, IoT and more specific web browser interaction. So I had a feeling that he was meaning, how would one who wants to write some web app that interacts through the browser or through something? But I agree with you. It's like, you know, plus how many devices have serial ports anymore anyway? That's another challenge. But if the person asking the question happens to be listening and wants to chime in, y'all can type in the chat. And by the way, if anybody else listening has a question they want to ask, and oh, darn, I didn't use the form. Well, you could go do the form. Don't worry. Just put it in right here in the chat. And John Farrar just piped in saying, sounds like an API-based solution. Well, again, yes, it would seemingly potentially be an API-based solution, but the real question is, where's the serial port?
Yeah, I'm not sure that APIs fix it because serial ports are not web-enabled by default. So, you know, once again, if it's attached to the machine, there's got to be some Java thing you can pull in, being as ColdFusion is Java, that you can use to read the serial port. If it's already producing some kind of API, then it's not a serial port question anymore. It's more of a question of how do I connect to an API? And that's an entirely different line of logic.
Yep. All right. So since the other person hasn't chimed in with any more, let's go ahead and move on to the next
question. Now, this is more of an open question, so John, we can kind of talk through the different pieces here. But the question statement is, discuss the different things as ColdFusion administrators should look for to make sure they have not been hacked, i.e. this X file appearing in some scripts directory and others.
Can you go ahead and pop that in?
I would be fair to say that Pete Freitag is going to come on the show soon, and this would be a great question for him, but I'm sure there's some things we can add to the mix here.
Right. So for sure, when Pete, and we're due to have him on soon, possibly even in 2 weeks, I believe is the current plan. We're working it out with him. I think his intent in that presentation will be to go over his tool called Fixinator. So let's take a step back when we look at this question and consider a few things. So there are things people can do to lock down their server. And for that, there's the ColdFusion lockdown guide, which Pete happened to write, by the way, and has been updated for each release since, I think, starting in CF8 was the first one. And then, as some of you know, in CF 2018, Adobe came out with something they called the auto lockdown tool. And its intent was to do everything that was in the lockdown guide by just running a command. And we could have another whole session about that, because sometimes just like following the entire lockdown guide could make your server unusable. Same with doing the lockdown tool. You'll find some people will find that it could make their server unusable. Things they're used to doing no longer work. Their code that used to run no longer works. And this is the kind of two-edged sword of security. It's great to make it more secure, but like you could put locks and bars on your windows, and then if you have a fire, you can't get out. Well, it's going to protect you from people getting in, but it keeps you from getting out unless you thought to design it to be able to easily be opened without being opened easily by the bad guy. So that's a whole world of things. But I'm just saying, we have to think when we talk about security, there's locking down the server, then there's locking down your code, which is still not getting to the question. I'm saying the next thing is locking down your code. And there's been, I want to just say this for everybody's sake, there's been a developer security guidelines document that Pete wrote. Yay, Pete. Pete's awesome. And it's been there since CF8. And I believe it was last updated in CF11. And if you are aware of it, again, write this down, developer security guidelines. Just Google ColdFusion developer security guidelines, and you'll find the document. And that's like a 30-page document that goes over the various things you need to be concerned about when you write your code to avoid SQL injection, to avoid cross-site scripting, and on and on and on. Well, then Pete's tool that he's going to talk about in a couple weeks is Fixinator, Fixinator, Fixinator. And if you just Google it, you'll find it. And that's a tool that allows you to look at your code and find what vulnerabilities there are. Now, it's not free, but it's not expensive, and it's really, really good. And so check it out or look to Pete's talk. And then some of you may know that Adobe in CF 2016 added a security code analyzer that lets you scan your code to find vulnerabilities. It's similar in concept. It's different in implementation. And one of the key differences is it only works with ColdFusion Enterprise, which is a real bummer. I don't understand that decision at all. I've railed against it. It's one of the few things that I think is just totally wrong. That should be in the developer edition. It should certainly be in the standard edition, and it should not be only in the enterprise edition. But anyway, so check that out. It's called the ColdFusion Security Code Analyzer, and it works also with ColdFusion Builder, which is a showstopper to some. But just use Builder to do the code analyzer. If you have enterprise, you should be at least trying it. If you're not doing anything else, get your Builder implemented. You can get a free version, and the free version after the trial ends still would work with this security code analyzer, I do believe. But anyway, now finally move into this question. This is more like, well, if the bad guys got in, let's say even before I did things to secure my server, or especially if I don't do anything to secure my server, what should I look for to see that I've been hacked, right? The other way to look at it. And they're saying, are there files I can look for that might exist in certain directories? And that's definitely representative of what had happened, especially in years past. There was a particularly bad hack that really grew to prominence in late 2012. Some of us in this arena, were celebrating the holidays in December 2012, and suddenly left and right, our client servers were getting hacked. And in February of 2013, Adobe came out with an update. And at that time, that was an update for 8 and 9 and 10, which had just come out. So that particular problem, I'm just saying this because it goes to this question the person's raising. That particular problem was a vulnerability where bad guys took advantage of the fact that people's ColdFusion admin API folder was open to the public. And if they hadn't set a password for it, it was able to be used to create a vulnerability. And the vulnerability, I can say this now because it's 8 years ago, it led it for people to easily call a particular URL that used the admin API to create a scheduled task on your server. And then that scheduled task, when it ran, because it was running in your CF environment, it pulled down some code, and that code got pulled down into the CF IDE directory, because the CF administrator could easily then write code to the CF IDE directory. So to answer the question, you would want to look at least to start in that CF IDE directory. Now in CF 2016 and above, Adobe blocked access to the administrator over web servers other than the built-in web server, and they default to securing even that CF IDE folder and its admin API folder. So this sort of problem is less likely in 2016 and above, but we've got people listening who are still on 11 or 10, 9 or 8. I talk with people all the time on every version. And yes, there's people running in production on 2021, so don't buy the assertion that nobody runs 2021 in production or won't until the first update. Sure, there's some people that are going to wait. Sure, there's others that are not going to do it until 2023, but there are people on all these different versions. And I'm just saying different people on different versions have a tendency to have the likelihood of problems having happened. So to the question, yes, you should. One place to look is there anything, let's just say to start, in the CFIDE folder that either you don't recognize, which I realize if you don't look at it often, you don't know what to look for, but also there's not that many files in there. If there's any CFM file in there, you would wonder, what is that? And if you could, you'd want to like compare it to like your local development environment, which isn't on the internet, we'd hope. And are the files the same as your local development environment? And if they're not, then you might have a problem there. And you want to do that. And unfortunately, the files that Adobe creates are encoded, so you can't just open them with an editor. The CFM files that Adobe creates and puts in the administrator and CFIDE folders. So you may not be able to rely on opening it and looking at it. But then I'll say, if you can open it and look at it, and let's put it that way, if you see a CFM that you don't recognize and you open it and look at it and it's got weird looking stuff in it, you've been hacked. And that's the scary thing, is once you find these, that's kind of the other end of the other side of the coin, is if you find such unexpected templates somewhere, it's too late, they're in. And then the question would be, well, what if you ran it? What would happen? And we don't want to make this the whole session, but let me just say that with some of these templates, the way they worked, there was no UI to them. Instead, they responded to query strings and form variables, and there were client-side tools that the hackers used that they would see an interface. They knew to run locally this browser-based thing that would show them a cool, nifty interface of all the cool things that could be done. And then it would just send a request to the server and hit one of these pages and cause that page to do the naughty stuff that it did. Now, if you do the lockdown guide, a lot of it's aimed towards preventing this sort of stuff. And one particular important thing that you ought to do, everybody ought to do, is ColdFusion by default runs as local system on Windows and Linux and Mac. And you might want to, root, whatever, it runs depending on the highest level, permission. And one of the key things in the lockdown guide is to change CF to run as a user other than local system or root. Define a user that has limited access, can only read and write specific folders. Again, we could talk more about this. Pete's talked about it. Other people, Dave Epler in the past, lots of folks in the past have talked about it. So you can find a lot more information on securing your server. That's not really what this person's asking. They're saying, how could I find if I've been hacked? So I said, look in that CFID folder, just because that was a common, prominent place to write such stuff. And then honestly, and it's hard, but some people will say, oh, it's trivial. And other people go, it'll be impossible. What would be best is if you do your development locally and you somehow synchronize your code in production with what you do in development. Some do version control, some just do FTP, whatever. I'm not into that debate, but I'm saying if whatever way you have it, if your local development only reflects what you have done or you've pulled down from an approved code repository, then your local development or your approved code repository is the authoritative copy of your code. We'll compare that with what's on the server. Because if what's on the server either doesn't match what's in your code repository or it doesn't match your local copy, if you're a developer that just does everything locally and FTP stuff up, okay. If you do that, then if you compare what's on your server to what is, the authoritative copy, you'll find if you've got code in there. And it could be CFM files, it could be CFML files, it could be other files that maybe don't have a CFM extension that bad guy code is including. So don't just look at CFM files, really look at anything that would be different between what's in the production environment and what's in some authoritative copy of the code that shouldn't be tamperable, right? So there's no way bad guys could get bad guy code into your source code repository unless you somehow push code from production into that, right? And you wouldn't normally do that. So anyway, that's enough of that topic from me. Dan, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I think the question that's being asked isn't really answerable because what
Right.
file will
Oh
be
yeah.
appear depend on
Hard.
which hack is being put in place at the moment. Like the FCK editor hack from back in the day would make an x.cfm file that would let you do file writes and all kind of crazy stuff. And
Right.
like you could block that file, they would just change the file name.
Yes.
Like it's not a simple question, and it's not really easy to make an exhaustive list of like weird files. So I think the best answer is just unfortunately lock it down. And
Sure.
somebody in the comments put in a file
Yes.
integrity manager
Yes.
idea, so you could do that. You could do directory compares. There's a bunch of different ways.
Right. Which is what I
Um,
was getting at.
Speaking of a
But
bunch of different,
before we move on, I do want to stress about Paul. So it's Paul Morgan Witz. He calls it a file integrity manager. There's also just change tracking mechanisms, and there's many for different OSs, and there's free ones and commercial ones. And I'll just say that if you go to my CF411, and whenever I say that, I actually watch some customers type in my CF4. No, the website cf411.com. If you go to cf411.com, that's just a URL that redirects to my website to a page I call the CF411, and it's over 2,000 tools and resources of interest to CFers, and I keep it up to date. I mean, I can't keep everything up to date, but I'm always updating it every week or so. So anyway, I have a category there on file. I don't call them integrity managers. So I'm trying to think. I think the term I use is file change trackers. But anyway, the point is at the top of the page is a list of the categories. First of resources, and you'll be amazed at the kind of resources that are out there. And then a list of tool categories. And you'll be able to see within those couple hundred at the top what the appropriate category would be for what we're talking about. I would stop and look at it, but you mentioned that you wanted to go ahead and move on. Before we do, Albertus responded earlier about serial ports. Maybe he's the one that asked the question. It's from the browser to tooling in manufacturing environments. We also use TCP/IP to access the tooling directly on the server. So, Albertus, are you saying you are the one that asked the question and this is what you want to know? Or are you saying you understand what this person wants and you're saying you guys do it as well? And while we wait for that, John Farrar commented to Albertus, I can remember exploring using Cfml for non-web server solutions. I'm thinking it could be done with Java integration. Yep, and that's what Dan was saying as well. So we're talking about sockets. Sockets can be reached through Java. ColdFusion runs on Java. So sometimes that kind of solution can be found there. Well, while we wait for Albertus, it sounds like, Dan, you had wanted to move on.
yeah, we got a few more questions. So this one's
Sure.
rather lengthy. I'm gonna have to paste it in sections.
Okay.
It is the primary, what I think they're getting at here is more of a fear, uncertainty, and doubt question around ColdFusion's viability. Let me just finish typing it in.
Sure. And while he does paste that in, I'll start reading what's been put in so far. Does it make any real sense to proof of concept in CF and then refactor as Java? So that's the question. And the kind of explanation is the person says CF has some stains on it. And if it can be resurrected as a rad tool for Java, we can all keep working for a little longer. We'll come back to some of these assertions. We'll naturally need to write OO and get stronger in Java for the refactoring, but we should be able to get a working app deployed faster than other languages. An open challenge with a prize might be interesting thing to do. Risky if CF loses, but it's losing a little bit of every day already. So I definitely have some.
A lot of assumptions in there, and I think we should start with the first one. So firstly, does it make sense to proof of concept in CF and refactor to Java? In the Java world, they have rapid development tools and frameworks that they like to use already. And so I would say the answer is no.
Right.
It doesn't make sense to do that. If you think about application development in general, it's really a function of what are your personal skills and your familiarities, language and syntax wise. And so conceptually, you could say, well, ColdFusion is Java, prototype in CF refactor to Java. But then you're building the same application 2 times in 2 different languages. possibly needing two different sets of folks to do it. And there's just a certain amount of inefficiency there that isn't very attractive. And I challenge you to go look at the modern Java ecosystem, and you'll see that rapid development is something that they've solved, as well as most other, platforms and language ecosystems have also solved what they view rapid application development. The next thing I would say here is, you say CF is losing every day. Like, I don't know any unemployed CF developers. In fact, there's quite the demand for CF developers. And so one would ask, by losing every day, like, what are you saying? Like, why are you saying that? Like, where's your viewpoint coming from?
Well, but we do hear that. And I agree with you. This you've said basically what I did want to say. So awesome.
Maybe go get my CF Undead t-shirt, Charlie, because I'll do it.
You might want to. Let's go back for a second to the first part. I just want to clarify something because, we said earlier and you repeated just then, ColdFusion under the covers does end up being Java. So somebody might say, well, heck, if it's Java anyway, it shouldn't be that big of a leap between what we write in CFML and the same thing in Java. And I would just say, well, time out, Sparky. There's if you could see the Java that gets created out of CFML, you would not want to live in the world of having to maintain that, because like any language that goes from one to another, it's got to be done in a way that performs well. It's not designed in a way to allow you to go back and forth. That's why there isn't even a feature, as far as I know, there isn't a feature to say, hey, I'd like to see what that Java is that ColdFusion gets converted into. Now, somebody might say, well, hold on there, Charlie. Since ColdFusion gets compiled into Java classes, the classes can be decompiled. And I'll say, yeah, absolutely. Someone could run a decompiler against ColdFusion's Java classes that get created for every CFML template. You're right. And again, if you were to look at that, you'd want to shoot yourself in the head. Go ahead.
It's not maintainable Java software. You know what I mean? It's Java that's created by a machine based off of,
right,
I hate to say it, unstructured input. Like, I write my code different than you,
right.
And
they design it to work well and perform well. They don't design it for you to look at it and go,
maintain it in a round fashion.
Yeah. So I agree with you that it doesn't, to me, make sense. And I think that a lot of the question stands on the rest of his or her contentions. So yeah, I agree with you. This CF has some stains on it. I just want to say, we got to say it. I mean, because you asked, the other question they said was CF is losing a little bit every day. Both of those just reflect the kind of common refrain we hear from some sides of the aisle, to use the political parlance, and in some circles in IT who want to just castigate CF as, boneheaded. Nobody uses it. And seriously, there's people listening today, they're on the meetup, who use it, who might believe they're the last people using it. And I can promise you, you are not, because, obviously the meetup having 3,000 members may or may not impress people. ColdFusion, let's be clear about this. Adobe just came out with CF 2021 in November. And one of the points I was going to get to later, and in case we don't, let me just say this now, they're already planning the next release. So Adobe's not giving up on ColdFusion. I don't care what everybody says. That's just a lot of BS. People say what they want to say and they get away with it. And it's just not true. I mean, if you look at things practically, the truth, like Dan said, is that it's not fair to say it's losing and that it's dead or that it's dying. But someone could say, yeah, well, I can't get it sold in my environment, or I never find it mentioned in IT, common resources, or every time it gets brought up, it gets poo-pooed on, or we can't hire CF developers. Yes, there's a lot of things that people could say that could be a negative against it. And the truth is, those sort of things can be said about many, many, many technologies. It's just the nature of technology that things go through phases. And CF is in a more mature phase. But, like a person that's in their 50s, to a person in their 20s, you think the person in the 50s is dying. And the person in the 50s, they could still be winning marathons and winning awards and things. It's just that their class, they're able to do it. So they're just different. They're just different. And it's not dying, but I understand that some people are going to probably jump in and try to say various reasons why, we're forgetting something. But Dan,
Well,
did you want to jump in?
Charlie, this is once again could suck up the whole CF meetup, and I don't know.
Yes,
how much
it could.
The fact is, there's tribalism in all forms of life, and technology is one of those forms of life. And the predominant thinking is, if my tribe isn't the biggest and best, then it's horrible. It's much like sports teams. My team's the best and your team is terrible.
Right.
At the end of the day, ColdFusion is not going to be a broadly used product, because if you look at the ones that are, they're all free runtimes.
Right.
ColdFusion is a paid runtime. Now, what do you get for paying? You get integration and QA and the modern features and support. And if those things are valuable to you, then you're in the right place. If they're not, you're in the wrong place. But, I live in the JavaScript world now, and things change so quickly. It's really difficult to build applications that'll last for 5 or 6 years without needing constant switching out of pieces that have become obsolete. And I've got source code that I wrote 2 decades ago that still runs perfectly in ColdFusion. Yeah. And the companies that pay for ColdFusion appreciate that, because they'd rather pay for a ColdFusion license than pay me to rebuild the whole application. So, there's plenty of room in this wide world of technology for niche products, and a niche can be a large niche. But, it's tribalism. Let's just blame tribalism and then ask the.
But let's throw out one thing in response. You mentioned that people just have, to accept paying for it. And of course, somebody I'm sure is wanting to jump in and say, hey, what about Lucy? Yes. So there's Lucy, the open source CFML engine. And some people find that their code works fine, and others find that they just have to make some modifications. And some people find that they just can't get things working at all. And they don't, Lucy doesn't purport to support everything that ColdFusion has. And even with the recent CF 2021 adding a lot of stuff, there's specifically some discussion going on in the Lucy community about what things that are added in 2021 ought to be added into Lucy. So there's just that constant spy versus spy sort of thing. But one of the questions here that just went by and just jumped off the top was from Gary. And he said, and this was in response to our discussion there. He was the first one to comment after we quoted the other question. Starting project to migrate some loose legacy CF apps from server to CF server to Lucy. Any tooling available for code compatibility, tips, gotchas, and best approach? And I'll just say quickly, and then Dan, you can jump in. As far as I know, this is one of the kind of shortcomings and challenges of making that move, is that yes, there's a couple of resources out there that talk about compatibility, but they're not complete. They're not always up to date. They're not always accurate. They're not always thorough. So yes, there are some. As far as tips, gotchas, and best approaches, I'll just say, as far as tips and gotchas, you'll learn more from people who've done it. And so there's a Lucy development forum, Discord, I believe, or just Discourse, one or the other. And if you, isn't it just a dev.lucy.org? But anyway, if you go to lucy.org, you'll find it readily. And that's the best thing to do if you're interested in making that transition. There's a community that's readily there and wants to help people making that transition. And they'll point you to resources if there's ones I'm not thinking of. And I think there probably is one that I'm not thinking of. But there's no tools as far as I know. It's really just one of those things where you got to try it. And it'll work great for some. And in fact, this is the same when people move from one version of CF to another. I'm telling you, I just like 2 months ago, I was helping somebody moving from CF8 to CF 2018. And then this week I've been helping somebody moving from CF10 to CF 2021. So there's the gamut of things. And then people going from, 18 to 21 or 16 to 18. And I tell everybody the same thing. It's literally the same thing. And you need to understand this, because you could hear stuff on the web, and I spend my day doing this stuff with people. So I feel like you could trust what I'm saying more than some people's opinion that are often biased. I'm saying it might go great. It might be a little bit of work. It might be a lot of work. or it might be impossible. It's any of those four, and you won't know. I mean, nobody can tell you, and you can't. There's no tool that can scan your code and tell you. Now, somebody might say, oh, wait, Charlie, don't forget in the CF Administrator, there's the code compatibility analyzer, and that's different than security code analyzer. That's in Builder. But yeah, if you didn't know, for many, many years, I think going back even like CF4, in the CF Administrator, I believe it's in the debugging section, there's a link there that says code compatibility analyzer or checker. And it's a web interface. And you just point to your code directory and hit submit, and it will look at your code and tell you for that code, what compatibility issues would you expect to move from that code into this current version. And there's even a drop down on the page to choose what version you're coming from, because it can't tell. And I've found it to be of some use, but often it's overkill. It'll tell you there's 1,000 things that'll go wrong, and that may not be terrible. And then you can change some things about it, and there's an advanced settings, and many people don't bother to look at that. So anyway, there's tools, yes, but these tools often don't really work. Just there, to me, there's no substitute for, you just got to run your code. And let me say, before I turn it over to Dan, this is so important. You can get a free developer version of ColdFusion, any version you want. Well, I guess you can't get the older versions from the Adobe website, but every version of CF has always had a free developer edition. So you could always get the latest version, put it in somewhere for free as a free developer edition, and test to your heart's content against it. And there's more I could say, but let me just leave it at that. And then if you said, well, I don't want to move to 2021, that's all I can get from Adobe. If you go to cfmlrepo.com, I believe it's .com, not .org, but CFML repo. If you just Google that, that's a site created originally by Gavin Picken of Ortis and the Modern Azure podcast fame. Anyway, he and others, myself included, contribute to that old installers. And when I say old, I mean like 2018, 2016. It goes all the way
back, Charlie.
Yes, and I was going to say that it goes all the way back. I think to 1.5 is the earliest one. So if you want to go see what it was like, you'd have to have an old Windows machine or Linux machine. I think Linux started in CF. Solaris was in 4. Anyway, I think Linux didn't start till 6. But anyway, moving on. Dan, Solaris, what do you want to say?
And then lasted until about 6, and the whole company blew up. Solaris, that is. I actually have never used Lucy. To me, the distinguishing reason to use ColdFusion is in some of the higher value features, and I don't know. It's just not been a tool I've used.
Well, let's throw out that a particularly strong reason that someone might want to use it, not only because it's free, because really I just always want to push back on the free to say, like Dan did say, ColdFusion is not that expensive. In the big picture, to some people's business needs, the cost of ColdFusion is like the equivalent of a meal for their staff for a day. You know, it's like not that big a deal. But it does mean to some people they don't want to spend even the couple $1,000s they might have to spend. So Lucy being free, that's compelling. But when the rubber meets the road is, for instance, if you want to deploy multiple machines with ColdFusion or multiple Docker containers, then you start running into that licensing becoming not really well suited. And that is for true. And then, by the way, the serverless deployment feature of CF 2021, integrating with Amazon's Lambda. I did a blog post on this a few weeks ago. You maybe didn't notice it, but that's been pulled. That's not in CF anymore. The doc page for it's gone. And the feature that you used to be able to download from the Adobe website for it is gone. And I think they didn't say this publicly, but I think what it is, they realized, oh, goodness, we don't have a solution for how to license that. And so I suspect they've pulled it while they work on that. And I have heard and seen some public mention by Rakshith that they are working on getting the licensing for things like the CF support of Lambda worked out with Amazon and how to get it deployed and stuff like that. It was particularly about how to get it deployed as a purely AWS thing instead of something you downloaded from Adobe. But anyway, where I'm going is to say, so someone might strongly be compelled to consider something like Lucy because they want to deploy, say several or dozens conceivably, or hundreds potentially, and they don't want to pay for all of those. So that's certainly a strong motivation. And there is a very large community behind it. They're very enthusiastic. There's companies supporting it. More people should support it if they're going to use it for free. They can't just take everything and not give back. So anyway, that's another subject. You can learn more about that in that community. But anything else you wanted to say, Dan, before we move on?
Let's hit the next one. So the question gets
from John. I know Ruby shops that have shifted to Node, also Node shops that have shifted to other platforms. So yes, CF does lose some battles, but that's not a sum gain loss statistic. It's like not a zero sum game is another way to put it. And as he says, Node shops shift to other platforms. So yes, they're, shiny objects are the bane of IT. Not everybody, lots of people just can't wait to go chase whatever seems to be the next big thing. Some do it for seeming business reasons. Some do it because that's just their interest. Some do it because they feel like they need to. They don't all always need to. So, it's the nature of the beast. But trust me, there are thousands of people still using CF, and they're not all using it grudgingly. They really aren't. I see this every day. Don't believe the hype. It's not true.
Well, it gets back to that tribalism thing. Like if you see people abandoning Node for Ruby or abandoning Ruby for Node, like the people that are making these decisions aren't making them because they're the logically perfect decisions. They're making them because they want to make those decisions. Yep. And we often forget the emotional side of humans because we work with machines all day long. But these are emotional arguments. Like Node and Ruby are equivalent until you start using them. And once you use them, you can make them bad and you can make them good. Let's get to this Raspberry Pi question. So the question was, because I want to give preference to those who filled out the form.
Yes, wink, let's clarify.
Has anybody packaging up home or in-office servers for local cloud cluster staging in smaller shops, including, of course, the Raspberry Pi cluster, perhaps? I need more information before I can answer this, but Charlie, is this at a point where you have some input?
Let me put it up there for everybody, so you can see the question while we're talking about it. So this it seems to presume use of CFML. It doesn't necessarily mean that, but let's just assume it does. And first of all, you can run ColdFusion or CFML on a Raspberry Pi. There's various ways. And some of you know that Brad Wood, used to show up at conferences a few years ago with a hat on, and the hat had a Raspberry Pi, and it was projecting information on the hat that was coming from CF running on the Raspberry Pi. And it's worth pointing out that, and in fact, we haven't had a chance to let's mention Command Box and the other great Ortus Solutions products. And I don't remember for sure, but Brad might, if he were here, might chime in, or maybe someone would chime in and say, yes, absolutely, you can use Command Box to deploy onto a Raspberry Pi. I don't remember, but I will say this. You can definitely deploy anything on a Raspberry Pi as Linux, and ColdFusion supports Linux. You can also deploy things on Raspberry Pi using Docker. And ColdFusion and Lucy both have Docker images, and Ortus has Docker images for both ColdFusion and Lucy. So I'll just say you got lots of choices. And just turning for a second, since he talks about a cluster, just this morning, I happened to come across an article series by a guy named Elton Stoneman. And I want to share that name really clearly for those that are interested in Docker. Elton, E-L-T-O-N, Elton Stoneman, S-T-O-N-E-M-A-N, Stoneman. Look him up. He's been writing about Docker for several years. He does have a bent towards Windows, but set that aside. He also talks about non-Windows deployment of Docker. And he did this series a couple years ago. I just came across it this morning, just coincidental. Wasn't looking for it for the answer to this question. And it's a series on deploying Docker clusters on Raspberry Pis using ARM architecture support that Docker now has. Well, I don't know if you even necessarily need to have an ARM architecture image. I don't believe you do. Somebody with more experience could say this, but I just wanted to point out that his article series was specifically about setting up a cluster of Raspberry Pis literally for business use, for small home office business use. And it's an interesting idea. And it was a multi-part series, and he covers various aspects of it, not just like technical stuff of Raspberry Pi, but it's really something anybody that's interested in Docker would enjoy, because he goes on to talk about using traffic to do the load balancing, TRAFIK traffic, however you want to pronounce it, which CF people might be interested to use in their environments in deploying ColdFusion on Docker. So has anybody else jumped in with any comment?
Yeah, there's a question here, but I actually thought of something I wanted to put back into the mix, because I was scrolling up to look up questions, and somebody mentioned that maybe they were having a hard time selling ColdFusion at their organization. And my statement to that would be, if the discussion is about the license fee or not, like should you pay the license fee or not, you've kind of lost the argument, because businesses don't pay license fees just because. They buy value. You should be able to articulate what is the value you're getting from ColdFusion, because that's what they're buying. And maybe that value is you're not going to spend 2 to 3 weeks testing and fixing your application to work on a free product, because I don't know what your hourly rate is, but it doesn't take much of an hourly rate to sort of blow right past a ColdFusion license cost. So I just want to throw that out there. We actually did have a fun question, and I think this would be great if the audience chimed in. Dan Skaggs.
Before you ask that, there were a couple responses about this current question. Let's get those in before we move on. So John Farrar said, I know there's big growth of ARM CPU chip systems, and I'm wondering about creating a local dev cluster in an office based on Pi. So I guess it's John who asked that question. And then he goes on to say the current images are packaged in non-ARM. They need to be packaged as ARM, which covers the new Macs. So John, are you saying that you've confirmed 100% that you cannot currently run either the Adobe ColdFusion images, the Lucy images from Lucy, or the command box images for CF or Lucy? You've confirmed that none of those work on a Raspberry Pi. I hadn't had a chance to test that. And while we wait for his answer, Dan Skaggs jumped in to confirm that, yes, traffic rocks. And I hope that's pronounced traffic. I've never heard anybody really say, how do you pronounce it? I'm sure it's somewhere. I'll tell you this, Nginx is not called Nginx. It's Nginx. But go ahead, Dan.
There needs to be a discussion about setting up Raspberry Pi dev infrastructure. I would wonder if that's really a good use of time, because development should match production is one of the oldest sayings that we use.
But some people are actually using Raspberry Pis for production, and it's almost more like a game and a hobby. But let's say this, because Dan made the point, Apple is going to ARM chips, ARM, and therefore this could be a way to get your toe dipping in the water. And then we should point out that Amazon, AWS, is now offering, or is soon to be offering, ARM support. So for those that will be deploying in that architecture, it's one way to start working with that architecture. Things like this, where does a Docker image work on that architecture? It would matter first, does it work on that architecture? And then you're right, unless you're really running Raspberry Pi in production, it's not a perfect representation, but it's closer than proving things on just an x86 architecture. But anyway, go ahead, Dan. Did you want to move on?
Yeah, let's get to the next question. So this one's one we can get some audience participation in. And the question was, with the announcement that ColdFusion Builder is moving to be built on top of VS Code, what VS Code plugins would you like to see from the community to make ColdFusion engineers' development experience better?
So let's clarify for folks who didn't hear the news yet. So CF Builder, ColdFusion Builder, has been around since, I think it started with CF9. And it was like an extension for Eclipse in CF8 called the Eclipse extensions for ColdFusion. And then in 9, they packaged it on Eclipse. So since from CF9 until now, ColdFusion Builder has been based on this underlying engine called Eclipse, which is a Java IDE. And many people over the years have flinched at its interface and found that aspects of it were quirky. And sometimes they wanted to rail against, quote, ColdFusion Builder, when what they really were railing against was Eclipse, which is what underlies CF Builder. So this past year, Adobe started making announcements in various conferences, and this is the news that this is getting at, that they're going to rebuild it instead of on Eclipse on VS Code, Visual Studio Code. Now, we should back up because some people listen to this. I'm telling you, I deal with people every day. I deal with hundreds of people every year. So I'm telling you, when I say this stuff, some people get in their little echo chambers and think that everybody thinks and knows what they think and know. But I see people on a wide swath of different experience levels and coming from different perspectives. And no, not everybody even knows what VS Code is. So let's talk for a second. Visual Studio Code is an editor that's become very prominent. I know some people think, come on, Charlie, you don't have to tell anybody. Yes, we have to tell some people this. It's an editor that's become very prominent in the development communities across the spectrum. Some people, when they hear VS and Visual Studio, they go, what do you mean it's for Windows? This is that Visual Studio crap. That was terrible. Don't try to tell me that's good. No. VS Code is not Visual Studio. It's almost like they shouldn't have used that name. But anyway, it has nothing to do with Visual Studio. VS Code is just an IDE, an editor. And when I say just, I mean, it's very powerful and it's very extensible. And it's become very popular across almost all, I won't say all, of course, can't say all, but many different languages, many modern development languages. And whether people are running Linux or Windows or Mac, a lot of people have fallen in love with VS Code. So Adobe recognized that. It's happened over the past couple to a few years, and it's really taken fruit in recent year or two. It's just become very clear. And in fact, the guys on the Modernize or Die podcast, which is from Ortus, if you're not familiar with that, just Google Modernize or Die. It's every week on Tuesdays at noon Central Time. Anyway, they have a segment called the VS Code tip, trick, or hint of the week. So they share tips every week about VS Code. And so Adobe recognized the prominence of it, and they are planning to rewrite Builder. So there will soon no longer be Builder on Eclipse. There will be Builder on Visual Studio Code, VS Code. And my understanding is that it's going to be packaged similarly, where you'll either be able to get it as an extension in your current VS Code, or if you don't use VS Code currently, you'll be able to get a packaged complete CF Builder, which happens to be VS Code under the covers. And you'll then be able to extend it just like you could if you had your own. So yeah, it's a very compelling thing. And then the question then is, what plugins would folks like to see from the community? Now, we should say there are many extensions, probably thousands of extensions. And there's literally dozens that people uniformly praise and say everybody should have, like the Docker one. If you use Docker, you should definitely get the Docker extension. And there's a CFML extension, and there's a couple of them, and one has more take up than others. So anyway, the question again was, what plugins would you like to see? And are there people jumping in? Yep. So John has said a linter and a debugger. And I do believe that and let's be clear, ColdFusion Builder has a debugger and has had it since CF8 in the old Eclipse extensions. So debugging has always been in CF Builder, but people didn't ever get to using it, or they tried it and it didn't work. Yes, they will have a debugger. They've said they will. Whether it'll be in the first edition or not, that's another question. But it is possible to do debugging of CFML. Eclipse and CF Builder have allowed it. For those who can't wait and don't want to use CF Builder, I want to point out that Fusion Reactor has debugging capabilities, and that's all done through a browser. You can point to lines of code, set conditions on which to break. But again, that's not the focus of this question. But yes, linters and debuggers would be nice. John mentions VS Code is built on Electron, same tool as Slack and other tools are built on.
Yeah, it'd be cool to right click on a keyword and get the docs for it. Or my very favorite, remind me exactly what date formats are again.
Right. Yep. And some of the plugins for CFML might offer that if you know the right either keyboard shortcut or click combination. So folks should look for that. Albertus points out, again, yes, there are CF plugins, and there's many different ones. And then John mentions Ortus already has a ColdBox and a TestBox extension we're talking about for VS Code. So, and I don't see other responses to that so far. John's referring back to an earlier point I made he said, he said, here's a link to Elton's speaking on Docker and RM. That link didn't come through for some reason, John, but note the title there, folks. Just Google Docker space plus space ARM. If you just search that or Bing that or whatever you like to use, DuckDuckGo, whatever, search for Docker plus ARM and you'll find his series. That says with BuildX. I don't know if that was a particular article in the series. I don't remember that it was. I don't remember it was the title. But anyway, he's got a series of what ended up being about 4 or 5 articles, and they were really quite interesting. All right. Anything else, Dan, that you've either got or that we've not yet touched on?
No, I think we've covered the submitted questions as well as touched on the ones that have come up. And we're actually just about at the top of the hour, so couldn't have gone more perfectly.
How about that? Let me just look back and make sure that we didn't miss anything. Sid mentioned that there's a Lucy channel on Slack, so sure. And there's a CFML Slack. Again, we need to clarify these things. There are some people here who maybe don't know that there is a very active CFML Slack. And if you just Google the phrase, I'll say Google, just trust me, it's like Kleenex. Come on. Google CFML Slack and you will find there's a resource that talks about how to do it. I've got links to it on my CF411 as well in the resources area. And so there's even different channels in the CFML Slack for your heart's content, because some people are more administrator types, some are more developers, some are more interested in whatever. And there's a bunch of different channels within there. And Lucy is certainly one of them. And there might even be sub channels in that. Well, I see some stuff that we missed. Here is okay. Well, we'll just put this out there. John's just making a statement. ColdFusion is used less for UI because we now do that more via Angular, React, and Vue. It's thriving as an API and still has some UI built in, and that is true. But let me just say that this is another one of those things where even Adobe frequently talks about how prominent use of APIs and development of APIs and API owner development is. And I'll just say, yeah, but there's a lot of people that don't yet do Angular, React, or Vue and don't yet use APIs. And of course, Dan has given some talks on it, and we've had some talks in the past on those topics and on APIs in general. So let's just recognize that, there's different people at different levels of, I don't know if we want to say maturity, just different levels of need to investigate different things. Go ahead, Dan.
You calling me old?
I can't do that. That would be totally throwing stones.
This isn't gray hair, it's wisdom marks.
But yeah, it looks like if anybody feels like we missed anything, it's kind of hard. This interface doesn't have a mechanism to like check off the ones that we've talked about. And since there's so many, we could have missed one. If anybody has one they want to throw in, go ahead. While we wait for, here's a couple of things that popped in at the bottom. Google this again. Okay, so John is saying Google this phrase, Elton Stoneman, Raspberry Pi ARM. Good. Thank you for that. And I'll just go ahead and take that away. People can look at the recording to see those words. Ortis has a Slack channel also outside that group. Okay. Their own non-CFML Slack servers. Okay. And then John quips about old yes, ancient not yet. Okay, cool. All right. So Dan, anything else? We got a couple minutes left. You want to talk about anything organizationally?
I think we've covered it, folks. If you're interested in maybe having a spot here on the meetup, we're always looking for great topics and presenters. We have a couple different kinds of formats. One is the one you're used to, where a presenter talks for 45, 55 minutes. Another format is more interactive, where we do like a show and tell and an interview style. And so if either one of those are interesting to you, hit us up. Let us know you're interested in talking, and we'll work through the details. There's a lot of smart people here, so it'd be good to hear what you have to say.
Yeah. And if you go to speak.coldfusionmeetup.com, that just redirects to a blog post I did, which talks more about the details if you need to wonder about any and consider things. But we're open to pretty much any topic that's tangentially related to CF. And as Dan said, we're not only flexible on the format, we're also flexible on the duration. If you have something where you think it's only going to be a half an hour, okay, that's cool. We'll do that. And we might get 2 people in that half hour, although usually the half hour goes longer than people expect. And then there's questions. So it might be 45 minutes. So we probably wouldn't do that. But if you had something that was 15 minutes, maybe we could find somebody else with 15 minutes and the 2 of them together could take between 45 minutes and an hour. So we're flexible. Don't be scared at all about the prospect of presenting, because this is an audience that's always been open to pretty much any topic. We don't, tolerate, and we don't get, nastiness in the group. So there's nothing to fear, really. We'll be there to protect you, and we'd help you however you want to get help getting started. So yeah, come on in. The water's fine.
That's right.
And thanks, John, for that. CF Meetup conference. I guess you're saying that, yeah, it's kind of a sense like that. Yeah, sure. But, we don't want to package it like that. And we want to do these things. We used to do them weekly. There were years in the past where we had them every week, and then some weeks and months we'd miss. We kind of tailed off 2017, I think, or 2018 in particular. We didn't have anybody, but then we came back this year, especially thanks again very much to Dan for getting involved and helping with finding folks. It's just, there's a lot that goes into running this, and it was a big help to have him help find other folks. And, we keep asking this way, but people don't seem to respond. So he, hits people up directly, and that seems to work well. And I really appreciate that you're doing that. And same thing to everybody else listening. If there's a topic, either that someone knows really well, or you think they've done a talk on it, ask them to present on the meetup. Sometimes they just need to be asked directly. And we just can't ask everybody that's out there. There's too many people. But if you've got something that you want to hear, even if you don't want to do it, press the person who might want to do it, because sometimes that's all it takes. And you can point them to the end of that, speak.coldfusionmeetup.com. I'll type it in here, speak.coldfusionmeetup.com. And if you just remember coldfusionmeetup.com, that's an easy way to get directed to the site, which is at meetup.com currently. Someday they may push me over the edge and I'll move to something else. But for now, we're still using it. It costs a lot of money, has a lot of hassles and limitations, but it works. So we're sticking with it for now. Anything else, Dan?
That covers it.
Okay. How about that? Just about right on time. All right, everybody. Well, thanks for coming, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. And we will have somebody next week. It's already been announced, and there might even be another one. And then we got people beyond that. So onward with the ColdFusion Meetup. Till the next time. See you guys.
Adios.